We had two homework problems and I want to go over them briefly. In each case, the question was construct an interpretation that shows that the argument is invalid. So here's a simple two-premise argument. If we're going to show that it's invalid, then there are two things that have to be true in that interpretation. The premise has to be true, and the denial of the conclusion has to be true. But if we look at the denial of the conclusion, we can see that by applying not error, we get something that's easy to work with. So first, we'll get this. Whoops. And then when we apply quantifier negation to this, we'll once again simplify things. So we're going to get for all x not gx. So we want this OR statement to be true, and we want this AND statement to be true. The nice thing about the AND statement is that that breaks down further into two pieces. We simply want each of those to be true. In fact, it would be fine just to list things in this way. These are the things that have to be true if we're going to refute the argument. So what we're going to do is build up a domain, a collection of things that are going to fit the predicates in some way or another, so that in this domain and with this interpretation, all of these things here turn out to be true. So where should we begin? Well, we know that in order for our interpretation to work, there has to be something in it that's an F. And that's easy. All we need to do is add one thing. I'm just going to add the number 1. And the number 1 is an F. Now maybe or maybe not, we'll have to come back and revisit not F. But for the time being, we'll leave things as they are. So no matter what we add to this interpretation, no matter what other things we put in the domain, in addition to 1, it's still going to turn out that there's something in the domain, namely 1, that is an F. Where next? Well, in order for our refutation to work, we have to make sure that when we add something to the domain, it's consistent with all the universals. This universal statement tells us that everything in our domain is a non-G. So we know that whenever we add anything to this domain, it has to be a non-G, or else this sentence won't come out true in our interpretation. That means that in particular, 1 has to be a non-G. Now, we might go back and ask at this point, if we stopped here, would all of our statements come out true? Obviously this one would if we stopped here, because the only thing in our interpretation is a non-G. But what about this? Is this true if our entire domain is the number 1, and if 1 is an F and not a G? Well, everything in the domain would be an F. And so even though nothing is a G, the OR statement is true. So this little one object domain, if we stop there, gives us an interpretation in which the premises of our argument are true and the conclusion is false. In other words, in which all of these statements here are true. So this refutes the argument. Going on to the next problem. Here we have a two-premise argument with an existential conclusion. And as a matter of fact, I mistranscribed this, so let me correct things before we go on. The second premise was supposed to read this way. So we want to know, can we construct an interpretation that refutes this? Now this is a little bit trickier, but we start out the same way. In our interpretation, we want the first premise to be true, and we want the second premise to be true, and we want the denial of the conclusion to be true. The denial of the conclusion amounts to this. And this part here, we know, can be rewritten using not arrow so that it comes out as fx and not hx. So we need all of these statements to be true in our interpretation. Once again, we'll set up the beginnings of a domain. We haven't decided exactly how many things are going to be in the domain or what they'll be, but we need to start somewhere. Now, on the one hand, it's often a good idea to begin with existentials, but in this case, the trouble is this. What does this existential say? It says something in the domain has to fit this. Well, that could be because there's a non-F in the domain. It could be because there's a G in the domain, or it could be both. It's a little unclear how to get going. Similar problems arise here. If this is true, then something in the domain fits this description, but there's more than one way for that to work out, so nothing's forced here. However, if we look at the conclusion, in fact, the denial of the conclusion, if we look at the denial of the conclusion, it requires that everything in our domain, no matter what, has to be an F and also has to be a non-H. So once again, let's put the number 1 into our domain. This statement requires that everything's an F and a non-H, so it requires that 1 is an F. We know that there won't be any non-Fs, but we'll just write this in here for the sake of being pretty. Now, this statement says nothing about G, and there is no reason at this point to say anything about G ourselves. But we do have one other piece of information. Everything in the domain has to be a non-H, and so that means that in particular, if the number 1 is part of our domain, it has to be a non-H. Now, let's pause here and see where this leaves the other statements. If we stopped here, this universal would be true. What about our two existentials? Well, we can't tell yet whether this first existential is true. There's something that's an F, and if that thing is a G, then that first existential is true. So we could just go ahead and say that 1 is a G. But before we do that, let's just check around and see if we can get any further information. This second statement says there's something in our domain that fits this description. If it's a G, it's a non-H. We know that the number 1 fits this description. We know that the number 1 fits this description because it's a non-H. So if the number 1 is a G, then the number 1 is a non-H just because it's a non-H, and that's how the truth table works. So this existential is true. Even if we add more things to the domain, this existential is true. The number 1 satisfies the relevant description. So to finish off, go back to the first premise. We know that there's one thing in the domain, it's an F. We haven't settled whether this one thing is a G or a non-G, but it's up to us. We're building the domain and we're building the interpretation. If we simply decide that the number 1 is a G, then this statement will be true because substituting the number 1 for X, we get if 1 is an F, then 1 is a G, and that is true in our interpretation. So something in our interpretation fits this description. The first premise says something fits this description, and indeed something does. That means that in both of these cases we were able to construct a refutation of the argument using just one object in our domain. That's all we need. So those are the answers to the homework problems, I noticed looking at a few people's that some people didn't say anything in this first problem about G, and that can't work. We have to have everything in the domain coming out as a non-G. That's part of what's required for our conclusion to be false. So if you're one of those people, you might want to review what we said about this first example again. But these two are relatively straightforward.